The S&B cold air intake with the oiled and reusable cotton air filter is for those of you that have a 1997 to 2006 TJ with the 4-liter 6-cylinder engine that are looking for a cold air intake that's going to provide a little more throttle response, also a little bit more noise from underneath the engine when you're under hard throttle, and also a few additional MPGs. This is going to be a very simple 1 out of 3 wrench installation. Even though it does come with a few more pieces than some of the other cold air intakes we've installed, it's still very simple. The instructions are really good, and we're going to show you how to get this installed in just a second. So the big benefits to a cold air intake are that it does help the engine breathe a little bit easier, and that can provide the things I mentioned just a second ago: better throttle response, a few more MPGs, a little more efficiency, and also some more noise from underneath the hood under hard acceleration. You can get a little bit more horsepower and a little bit more torque as well with a cold air intake, but most of that's going to come at a part of the RPM range where you don't spend a ton of your time. So I wouldn't expect this to be a night and day from your factory intake system to a cold air intake system on a TJ like this, especially because this engine has been around forever and it's really optimized right from the factory. So the intake system isn't drastically limiting the power that the engine can make, so keep that in mind. But if you are looking for a cold air intake because you want those 3 things that I mentioned, that better efficiency, noise from underneath the engine, and a little bit better throttle response, this is going to be a really nice choice for you. This is going to be a plastic cold air intake system as opposed to some of the other ones that come with a metal tube, and that's not better or worse, just something to note. It's also going to be a closed airbox system. So some of the intake systems will have a little bit of a heat shield, and the idea there is that it's pulling colder air, but it's still pulling air from underneath the engine bay, and air can really get around that heat shield. So by having a sealed airbox system, you're only pulling air from exactly where it wants to be pulling air from, which ideally is the coldest air that you can get while still pulling air from underneath the hood. The only way to do that is by pulling air from outside the engine bay, and most of those options are going to be full-on snorkels. But as far as something underneath the engine bay goes, a sealed airbox system is going to be a really nice way to go. One thing that I like about this sealed airbox is that it has a plexiglass lid on it, so you can actually look down in there and see when your filter is getting dirty. And because this comes with a cleanable and re-oilable filter, all you have to do is pop the filter off, clean it out, re-oil it, pop it back in, and you're good to go. Some of the other systems have a sealed off filter, and as the saying goes, out of sight, out of mind, you might not remember that it's starting to get dirty on you. Some other systems, more expensive systems on the market, have come up with some really sophisticated vacuum mechanisms to tell you when your filter's dirty because you can't see it, but this is a much less complicated system. You pop the hood, you take a look, you can see whether it's clean or whether it's dirty. So overall, I think it's a pretty good system. The intake tube here is a really large diameter. You have to remember though, you are still going to be limited by the size of your throttle body. So even though all this stuff is massive, it is going to get choked down as it goes into the throttle body there. But overall, like I said, pretty solid cold air intake system for your Jeep. Now, because this cold air intake system does have the sealed box on it, it is going to be a little bit more expensive than some of the cold air intake systems that just have a little heat shield. This one comes in at right around $300. Now, for an air intake system, yeah, that's a little bit more expensive than some of the others, but you are getting the sealed box, you are getting the plexiglass here, which is a feature that I like, and you are getting a really large intake system where a lot of the other ones on the market are going to be a little bit smaller. So overall, if you're looking for a cold air intake, this is going to be a pretty good option for you. Now, I will note that if you do a lot of off-roading in wet areas, you do a lot of water crossings, creek crossings, even play in the mud a lot, the cold air intake system might not be the best option for you because it does make it easier to suck water into the engine, which can be catastrophic for the engine. This having a sealed air box system means that the water has to make it into the box. The box has to completely fill up, and this does have a drain hole in the bottom, and then the water needs to get sucked in. So is it going to happen every time you go through a puddle? No, but again, just something to keep in mind. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a very easy system to install on your Jeep, 1 out of 3 wrenches. So let's show you how to do it. For this installation, we used an 8mm socket and a 13mm socket, as well as a number 3 Phillips tip socket and a 6-inch extension, all driven by our 3/8 electric impact. We also used a pair of diagonal cutters and an adjustable wrench. So the first step in this install is going to be removing our factory intake out of the Jeep, and of course we're going to have to pop the hood to get that done. There are a couple of clamps that is going to come out pretty easily. One thing I do want to note is that our airbox has been in and out a whole bunch of times, and we actually have a couple of nutserts in the inner fender here that hold our airbox in place. If you don't, if you have a factory setup, you probably have to get to those bolts from inside the fender here. So it's just a little bit of a difference from how we're gonna take ours apart versus how you're gonna take yours apart. So I did wanna note that right off the bat. But first things first, let's get the hood popped and we'll start taking things apart. So the order of operations here isn't too important. The bottom line is that you're going to remove your intake tube and your intake air box. You're also going to have to remove this core support bracket here that goes from the firewall out to your grill. So we're actually going to start with this bar first, and it'll make it a little bit easier for us to get everything else removed. So just 2 bolts to get that out of the way. Now we can get the lid off of our airbox, get the filter out, and that'll give us access to those screws on the inside of the airbox. Again, if you have a factory TJ, you'll be accessing these screws from inside the fender liner. With those bolts removed, we'll take the airbox out of the Jeep. Now we're going to remove our vent tube here from the factory intake and also loosen up the clamp on top of the throttle body. That will allow us to remove the whole air intake tube out of the Jeep. Now our air intake tube came out very, very easily. Like I said, we just had this vent to remove here, but if you have a newer TJ, you're gonna have an air intake temp sensor, and that's going to be drilled in with a bung here. So you're going to have to disconnect the wiring harness from that sensor, and you do wanna be careful with the sensor because you're gonna remove it from your factory intake and put it in your new intake. So just one extra step that we didn't have to do, but if you have a newer TJ, you are going to have to do. Now that we're on to the installation, there's a little bit of assembly to do on our air intake tube. So we have this coupler. It's going to go from a larger diameter to a smaller, and that's going to slide right over the end of this tube here. And once it's seated, we're going to use these 2 clamps to secure it. This clamp will just leave loose until we connect it onto the throttle body. Now again, because we don't have an air intake temp sensor on our Jeep, we're just gonna be putting this rubber plug in this hole here. If you do, you're gonna be screwing a barb in there so that you can attach your sensor and then your wiring. Next, we have a little bit more assembly to do. We have these 2 intake tubes. We're gonna mate them together with this coupler and a couple more hose clamps. Get that clamp tightened down, and then we'll put the other one on. I'll slide this intake tube into the coupler and then tighten down that other hose clamp. Now we're just going to set this aside for a second while we get our air intake box installed. Now we're ready to install our air box, but first we have a little bit of assembly there to do as well. So we have this rubber cuff that's going to go over top of this end of the air box, and that just slides inside the box just like that. And then we're going to put one more hose clamp around the outside of that and tighten it down before we bolt the box into the Jeep. Just like before, we'll bend the hose clamp so that it's oval shaped, slide it over top of the rubber cuff. Once it's sitting how we like it, we'll tighten it down. Now we'll drop the airbox into place, and it's going to go right into the factory location. So there are actually 4 holes in the bottom of your airbox. You're only going to use the 3 factory mounting locations to get the airbox attached to the inside of the fender. That 4th hole, that's for water drainage. In case any water were to enter the airbox, it's going to be able to drain right out the bottom instead of getting sucked into the engine, which of course is a very bad thing. Now, this does come with all the hardware you're going to need to get it attached to the fender. It's going to come with nut and bolt hardware as well as a couple of washers But as I already mentioned, our fender has a couple of nutserts installed in it, so we're actually going to be using the factory hardware along with the washers that come in the kit. Once we get all of the hardware started by hand, we can tighten it down with our impacts. Now we're going to install our air filter into our air box. At this point, we're really just going to set it in place because this connects directly onto our intake tube. Once we have it in the box, we'll be able to maneuver the tube in a way that we can put the filter on the end of it and then tighten down this hose clamp. Now that the filter is in the air box, we'll grab the end of our air intake tube, slide it through the cuff, and connect it to the other end of our filter. There we go, everything's all connected up, and then we can tighten up our hose clamp. The next step is to install this gasket in the top of the air intake box. This gasket is going to help seal the plexiglass top for the air intake box to the box itself so there aren't any air leaks there. So this is really just going to lay in this channel here, pretty straightforward. We are going to have a little extra material at the end, so we have a pair of cutting pliers ready to go so we can trim it up. And of course, just used a sharp utility knife as well. So like I said, just a little bit extra. We'll cut that off right here and tuck that last end in. At this point, we're going to install this plastic barb into our air intake tube here. And this is going to be the other end of where our vent tube from the top of our valve cover is going to attach. So this tube's a little bit short. We also have a new one of these. So once we get this threaded in place, we'll replace our tube with the longer one and get everything connected. Now it's important that you tighten this down by hand and then put 1, maybe 2 turns on it with a wrench. Of course, with this being plastic, you don't want to crack it. Now we'll replace this vent hose. As I said, this one's going to be a little too short to reach. You'll want to remove this from the plastic fitting on top of the valve cover, but you do want to be careful. You can very easily crack that plastic elbow, and if you do, you'll have an air leak. This is that elbow I was referring to, so again, be very careful when you're removing the tube from that. And then we have our new longer tube that comes in our kit, and we'll just slide that right into place. The last thing to do on this end is to set the intake tube over top of the throttle body. Make sure it's seated nicely, and then tighten down this last hose clamp. The final step in the install is to install this piece of plexiglass on top of our air box. As you can see, it has some protective paper over top of it that we'll remove first. Paper removed, you can set the plexi right over top of the air box here and use the included hardware to tighten it down. I'm going to have some small screws here with some rubber gaskets. As always, we'll want to start the hardware by hand a couple of turns before we tighten it down with any sort of tool. And that's going to do it for our install. So if you are looking for a unique looking cold air intake for your TJ, I would recommend this option from S&B, and you can find it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.